Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has easily survived his leadership review at the Conservative convention last night, receiving 87% support from his party. Now, if you follow Canadian politics to any extent, this is far from surprising. Pierre is in a unique position as a party leader where he enjoys almost historic support from his base. Conservatives love this guy, and they always have. And he definitely feeds his base exactly what they want to hear. He's very in touch with his base. And in that way, he's been very successful. But when you look at opinions of him outside of the conservative base, that's where he really struggles. That's where he really fails to grab a foothold. But what it looks like here is that the Conservative Party, the bet that they're making is that even though Pierre Poilievre is not popular with Canadians broadly, because they love him so much, because they want to see his agenda and ideas implemented, they are going to stick strong with him and just hope that eventually there's enough discontent with the Liberals, with the status quo, that he'll be able to get voted into office just based on people voting against the Liberals. At least from my perspective, it seems like that's the calculation, because again, when you look at, for example, preferred prime minister polling from Nanos here, Mark Carney is more than double Pierre Poilievre here. He's decimating him in support. And frankly, I'm surprised it's not higher because, 30 to 38% of Canadians are conservative. The fact that Pierre doesn't even hit the 30% number is interesting to me. But even if he was, getting that full 30 to 38%, still well behind the 52% of people who have Mark Carney as their preferred prime minister. And in general, this is kind of the story that you see. Although only 30% of Canadians believe that the country is headed in the right direction, I think a lot of Canadians just have perspective. Because if you look at Canadians who think the world is going in the right direction, it's 12%. So it seems to me like although there's such a low percentage of Canadians who think that we're going in the right direction, it seems like a lot of people don't view that as unique to the Liberals, as a uniquely Canadian problem. If anything, this shows that at least 26% of people think that Canada is going in a better direction than the world overall. So it's not quite so black and white. Yes, people are very concerned, as you can see here, that the rising cost of living is absurd. The economy's not been in a great place, and healthcare is in a bad place. So you see here that affordability healthcare is at the top of people's minds. And that's kind of the argument that Pierre was making in his speech last night, right? He's talking about out of control, open borders, immigration, overwhelming healthcare, housing, and job markets. Talking about how the liberal failures of the past decade have brought us to this place where the economy and affordability are in such bad places. And I think that argument is potent and it holds a lot of weight, especially with the conservative base. But I think where it misses, and this is my own personal issue with it, is he consistently is blaming the Liberals, 10 years of liberal rule, how it's more costly, crime-ridden, dangerous. He loves to talk about like the last 10 years of liberal rule, the decade of liberal failure, and how that has led to where we're at now. But for Canadians like myself, I never hear him talk about Canada in the larger scope of the global crises that are happening right now, because all the issues facing Canada when it comes to affordability, housing, healthcare, these are issues that we're seeing across the world, from Europe to North America, mostly in the West, but we're seeing it in many southern and eastern countries as well. So like the issues that we're facing, although yes, it's very easy to put all of the blame on the party that's been in power for the last 10 years. And I think that argument is potent. And I think there's a reason that for the first time in a long time, young Canadians are much more supportive of the Conservatives than any other party, because Pierre's whole message is it's time for change. It's time to, kind of shake up the status quo. And if you're a young Canadian who's only ever grown up under a liberal government ever since you were politically aware, and you're dealing with, barely being able to afford rent, being straddled with student debt, kind of really worried about your financial future, not sure if you'll ever own a home, trying really hard to find a good paying job, but it kind of feels like there's a lack of stable, good paying jobs out there. Obviously if you're a young Canadian, and I am one myself, in that position, then it's very easy to just look at who's been in power for the last 10 years. And Pierre is making that argument saying, hey, this is all you've ever grown up under. It's time for a change. Why don't you try something different? Try our vision for Canada. So it's a potent argument for sure, but I think why he doesn't attract someone like myself and many other Canadians, especially older Canadians, is that if you're politically aware of what is happening around the entire globe, then you'll understand that these trends in Canada, you can't just blame it on the Liberal government. It's a much larger crisis of what I would define as late stage capitalism, but no matter how you want to define it, really this is a result of globalization. It's a result of corporations kind of running wild and not really being reined in. And, my criticisms of the Liberal Party over the last decade would be more in that vein. The fact that they haven't cracked down on corporations and hedge funds and private entities buying up homes and housing, kind of being a core fuel of this housing crisis. I would blame them for not building enough homes, not quickly enough, right? Like there are definitely things where the Liberal Party could have done better because, although Canada affordability wise is very average when it comes to Western nations, the one area where we are doing worse for sure is housing. So there are definitely places of blame for the Liberal government. But there's also a large element of the affordability crisis that even with the proposals and solutions that Pierre is proposing, it wouldn't actually fix any of this stuff. Most of Pierre's platform relies on, cutting capital gains taxes, cutting the corporate carbon tax, cutting taxes for the rich in general. It's kind of like this old school Reaganomics, deregulation, cut taxes type of free market ideology, which doesn't really address the root cause of this affordability crisis, which again is much more so kind of the opposite. It's really the fact that we've let corporations do whatever they want. We've let there be a monopoly in groceries and telecom. And again, the fact that housing is being turned into this wealth generating scheme instead of being treated as a human right or as something that we should just try to provide to as many people as possible at a low cost. He talks about building more homes, but so does the leaders of every party. Supply is only one part of it. If you build a ton of new homes, but then those homes are all bought by private speculators, private interests who then just jack up those prices and rent them out to people at exorbitant costs, then more supply, it's never a bad thing, but it's not going to fully solve the issue. So that is my big issue with Pierre's message. And I think it's the reason why you'll see that outside of the conservative base, his message isn't fully resonating because yes, the problems he identifies are ones that all Canadians identify. That's why these are the top priorities of the Canadian people right now, because we're all feeling the burden of the cost of living, affordability, housing, healthcare. His diagnosis of the problems is not the issue. He's 100% correct, but it's the solutions he provides and his framing of the issue as being just 100% because of the Liberal government. He doesn't talk at all about the global trends. He doesn't address the fact that every other country in Europe, America, Canada, we're all dealing with the same stuff. And so to me, that just makes him sound kind of like a snake oil salesman in a way, where it just seems like he wants power, and it's easy to do that by blaming the government who's been in power. And yes, you should definitely hold the Liberals to account, right? They're far from perfect. There's a lot more they could have done to help us during this affordability crisis, but this is a global issue. This is a supply chain issue. This is a resource issue. This is a globalism issue. And when I say globalism, I don't mean it in the conspiratorial sense. I mean it in the literal sense of the fact that our economies are becoming so intertwined at a global level. Supply chains are global. I definitely am someone who advocates for more self-sufficiency at home. I think it would help kind of deflect and protect against a lot of these trends. But my point is that the fact that Pierre only ever blames the Liberals and doesn't give this global perspective, it tells me that he doesn't really care or see the real issue here. Because again, if everything we're going through was just 100% the Liberals' fault, then you wouldn't see these same issues happening in the States, in Spain, in the UK, in Germany, in France, right? If it was just because of the Liberals, then we wouldn't have seen this in every country. And so I think Pierre, without changing that framing, if all he continues to do is just blame the Liberals, blame Mark Carney, blame Trudeau for the decade before Mark Carney, I feel like against Trudeau it held more weight because Canadians, by the end of Trudeau's term, they didn't really like Trudeau. Whereas Mark Carney, you can see here, he's actually more popular than ever, and you can chalk a lot of that up to the way he's been dealing with Trump. You can see here this spike kind of happens in the wake of his Davos speech. Obviously that was really influential and has made a lot of people feel more positively about him. But I mean, Mark Carney's entire time in politics, he's been more popular than he has been unpopular, and especially since he's been prime minister. So even if, you look up here, again, most Canadians think that Canada is not going in the right direction. They don't really blame that on Mark Carney, outside of the Conservative base. Because if you come down here, you look at his Mark Carney's approval ratings, he's literally popular with every single group, including people who live in Alberta and the prairies. The only group that he's underwater with is the Conservative base. But even with NDP voters, even with Bloc Québécois voters, and especially with his own base, he enjoys an incredibly strong rating from his own base. And with every income bracket, he's at least 16 points above water. I mean, this is a very popular prime minister, especially coming off of the Trudeau era, where ever since, the early 2020s, he became very unpopular. This is a level of popularity that Pierre is not used to having to deal with as leader of the opposition. Against Trudeau, he was a really easy punching bag for Pierre because Canadians already agreed with him. But making this case against Mark Carney, he has a lot more work to do because Canadians just don't see him the same as Trudeau, even though Pierre tries to paint him that way. And then you look at the net impression of Pierre, it's the complete opposite. He's underwater in almost every category, except, as I said, with young people, where he actually enjoys a strangely high support. Now, young people still support Mark Carney even more, seemingly, as prime minister, even though if you look at their support for political parties, they do support the Conservative Party more, specifically the 18 to 29 bracket. But the opinions of Pierre as a leader, he's not even as popular with his own base as the Liberals, 68% versus 82% for Carney with his own base. And then unlike Carney, where the other parties besides the Conservative voters actually kind of like him, the Bloc Québécois voters hate Pierre, NDP hates Pierre, obviously Liberal voters hate Pierre. And in Canada as a whole, he's underwater, right? So I can understand from a Conservative voter's perspective why they love Pierre, because he's a unapologetic conservative warrior, and he doesn't really back down on his stances, and he doesn't really compromise. But I think that lack of compromise and this really unapologetically oppositional rhetoric from Pierre, where he just blames Trudeau, just blames Carney, just blames the Liberals without having this global perspective, I think for people outside the Conservative base, we can see that message just isn't resonating anymore. Because yes, we all feel the affordability crisis. We all want there to be solutions implemented, but just blaming the Liberals and then saying you're going to cut taxes, that's just not going to solve the problems we're facing. And I think a lot of Canadians know that. And then there's also the fact that a lot of people kind of see Pierre as analogous to the Trump and MAGA movement. I mean, Pierre in the past has been openly warm and supportive to Trump, and he's been less so in Trump's second term because it's not really viable in Canada. But if you ask a lot of Canadian Conservative voters, not all of them, but many of them do like Trump, do like the MAGA movement. And again, this is the tension that Pierre faces, where his base wants one thing, but the rest of Canada wants something completely different. And unfortunately, you can't win an election with just the Conservative base. And I think that's also a stark difference between Carney and Pierre and the Liberals right now and Pierre, is that the Liberals don't really demonize the Conservatives. They don't really demonize Conservative voters. If anything, they've been making a lot of overtures to win them over, even though it's not really working. Because, if you're a Conservative, why would you want Conservative light when you can get the real thing? But I mean, Carney has been much more conservative than Trudeau. And again, even just rhetorically, he's been much more welcoming, much more open to Conservatives and Conservative voters, welcoming floor crossers, saying that he wants to work with Pierre and the opposition as much as possible and trying to compromise on things. You didn't see that much under Trudeau, especially the later years. And that's just a very stark contrast to Pierre, who really demonizes the Liberals at every possible opportunity, especially in front of his own base, and who is really isolating in that sense. And I think it's a big problem for him going forward. And I do think the only way that he stands a chance of ever becoming prime minister is if the Conservative base just keeps voting him in as leader long enough until we finally get to a change election where Canadians just want to try something new because they're sick of the affordability crisis. And honestly, it's a really unique set of circumstances that allowed Mark Carney to even win the last election, because up until Trump got elected, up until Trudeau dropped out, that was set to be a massive change election. But now at this point, I think a lot of Canadians are open to seeing what Mark Carney does, because he is taking the Liberals in a more conservative direction. So I think in a lot of Canadians' minds, they're kind of getting the best of both worlds. They don't have to deal with Pierre as a leader who they personally don't like, but they also are getting some more conservative and centrist policies under the Carney government than the Trudeau government. So I think, again, Although I'm not at all surprised about the endorsement from the conservative base, the Conservative Party, for Pierre's continued leadership. It makes a lot of sense, and a lot of them have been citing how Stephen Harper lost the 2004 election, but then got a strong mandate from his party in 2005, and then, of course, went on to be prime minister in the next election. So that's kind of the model that conservative voters are hoping will happen. They don't think just because Pierre lost last election that he'll never win. But again, personally, I just think that as of now, I mean, things could change. Politics changes very quickly. There could be a huge scandal, a huge crisis that happens that ends up turning Mark Carney's extreme favorability into extreme unfavorability. It is possible. But if there was an election held today, we do see that the vote shares would be pretty identical to the last election. Barely anything has changed. The conservative vote share is the same. The liberals are up by 2 points, but that's within the margin of error. So honestly, from my perspective, if there was another election today, I think that the seat count would be very similar. If anything, I feel like the liberals might even gain a seat or two and to get a majority. Personally, as a Canadian myself, I don't want another election anytime soon. I just want to see this current liberal minority govern and work across the aisle with parties like the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, or even the Conservatives if it's for good legislation. As long as the legislation is good, I don't care who supports it. But I think a lot of Canadians, we're not really too focused on having another election. We're just focused on kind of concrete action that is going to help us. And I mean, if another election would lead to that, by all means, let's do it. But right now, it feels like I'm more in favor of unity and action than partisanship. And again, I want action that is actually going to address the root causes of this crisis, which I don't think we're seeing from Carney. You know, I'm a big fan of a lot of the trade deals and partnerships that he's securing around the world. I think that's definitely the most positive aspect of his premiership so far. But I do think in terms of addressing the root causes of housing affordability, we're not really seeing concrete action there either. But again, the reason why I'm not inclined to believe that Pierre Poilievre can fix it either is because the solutions that he's offering is really similar to what Carney's doing. I mean, they keep teasing the Carney government that they just are stealing conservative policies, but frankly, what that tells me is that conservative policies aren't the answer either, because things are not changing and they're not showing any sign of changing soon. So yeah, that's kind of my take on this whole Pierre situation. I know the conservative voters absolutely love him, so they're very happy that he's back in power. But frankly, I think the liberals are happy that he survived this leadership review as well, because when you look at the personal impressions of Pierre versus Carney, this obviously gives the liberals a massive upper hand.